For today's lesson, we are going to be going over some watercolor techniques. These are the basic notes and techniques that we are going to be covering. So on a page in your sketchbook, we are going to do some of these notes. So the first thing that I would like you to do is, with a pencil or pen or marker of your choice, you are going to write the word watercolor across the top of your page. The first thing that you need to know about watercolor is that it is a pigment bound by water. Pigment is the color that you see in any art supply, any project. That is the ground up powder of color. And then in order to bind that pigment into an art supply like watercolor or oil pastel, you need to use a binder. In this case, we are using water. The next thing you need to understand about watercolor is that once the pigment is bound by water, the pigment dries out. So what that means is that inside of this watercolor case, we have these little pans of pigment that have been dried into the mold of the oval shape, and that is how you get your watercolor. The last thing that you need to know about watercolors is if your pigment is dried out and the pigment is bound by water, in order to rehydrate it to make it active, we need to add water. Please understand that water goes a long way. So that means a little bit of pigment goes a long way. That means that you do not need a lot of color in order to make your watercolors work. While watercolor is a paint, we want to make sure that it is thin and watery. The color should not be thick like a regular acrylic or craft paint. We want this to be thin and translucent and pastel and watery. The color is not meant to be bright and thick and vibrant unless you're building up the color saturation. Most paints sit on top of the paper, but watercolor stains the paper, meaning that it seeps into the paper surface and stains the surface versus being a thick layer painted on top of the surface. We're going to learn two techniques today. Technique number one is called wet on dry. Wet on dry means that you're taking wet paint and painting it on dry paper. You have good control with this technique. The second technique that we are going to practice today is wet on wet. It is the opposite of painting wet on dry, meaning that you are painting wet paint on top of wet paper. With this technique, you have less control. All right, so let's get started. What you are going to need is a container of fresh water. Try and keep your water as clean as possible. Dirty water is okay, but if it's getting too contaminated, you're going to need to refill and refresh. You are going to need a watercolor palette, and inside your watercolor palette should be a paintbrush. So these are the three things that we are going to need for today's lesson. The first thing that you are going to need to do is take your paintbrush and you are going to swirl it gently in your cup of water. In order to hydrate and activate, we have to add water to our dried out pigment. Remember, a little bit goes a long way. So we're not using black and brown. We're going to use the 6 colors on the color wheel. And one thing that I highly encourage as an artist is that you mix your own colors. Try to avoid using the color straight out of the pan. You always want to mix. So you are going to get water into your bristles, bring them over to the pan that you want to use, and you're going to hydrate that, bring it over to your palette. We are just transferring some pigment from the pan to the tray. Then I'm going to mix in a little bit of blue, add some more water, and we're ready to go. With wet on dry, you are going to notice that your paint is going to have good control, and your line in your paint is exactly where you choose to put it. The color does not go anywhere. So with wet on dry, you have really good control. Where you choose to put the paint is where the paint goes. Wet on wet is a little bit different. You have a little bit less control and it works better in abstract backgrounds or painting large spaces. So the first thing you want to do is get a clean paintbrush and load it with water. And you are going to paint your paper first with fresh, clean water. Try and use about 3 swishes of water before activating your paint. Now that we have our paint, we are going to pick up some pigment and we are going to tap. And your color is going to burst and spread into the water that you painted down. Now, if you find that your color is not bursting very well, you can always add more water. Notice that I am tapping the paper. This is because I do not want to over scrub or rough up the surface of the paper too much, especially because what we are using is technically not watercolor paper. So we want to be gentle and careful with the surface. The beautiful thing about wet on wet is that your colors are going to mix and interact on their own. You can guide in them and push them a little bit to where you want them to go, but for the most part, they're going to burst, spread, and mix on their own. And that is how you do the 2 basic watercolor techniques and understand the basics of watercolor. For cleanup, you are going to take your paintbrush and just swish it around in some clean water. You can do a skin test to make sure that there's no pigment left in the bristles. And you are going to take your paintbrush and just dry it off with a paper towel or tissue. We're going to put this back into the watercolor tray. The next thing you need to do is clean out the watercolor tray. So I'm just going to get a tissue or a paper towel, and I am just going to blot out as much as the color and pigment as I can. If your pigment is not completely lifting out, you can add a little tiny amount of water to just rehydrate and rinse out most of the tray. Some of the colors might stain, that's okay. We just need to make sure that most of the color is off of the tray. And that is how you paint wet on wet and wet on dry with your And that is how you paint wet on dry and wet on wet with watercolor.